Over the last few months, we've seen some of the worst atrocities committed in the 21st century, committed in full public view, documented every single day, often because of the courage of Palestinian journalists who have suffered the biggest mass slaughter of journalists ever recorded in any conflict, often being slaughtered alongside their families. We've seen tens of thousands of Palestinians killed, many of them, of course, children, all of which armed and facilitated, not least of all, by the United States and, to a lesser extent, but a very important extent, by European allies like Germany and, of course, my country, the United Kingdom. Now, the media, the vast majority of the Western media has failed catastrophically. The dehumanization of the Palestinian people has not been subtle, to say the least. The worth attached to Palestinian life, virtually meaningless throughout much of this horror. Now, we've been very fortunate to have the brilliant journalism of Al Jazeera throughout this, and the incredibly courageous work of Al Jazeera, which has earned them a coordinated, concerted attack, of course, by the Israeli government, who have waged war on Al Jazeera. Now, there's a brilliant documentary, which everyone needs to see, by Al Jazeera fault line journalists, entitled The Night Won't End, looking at civilian killings, the mass slaughter of civilians by the Israeli military. That's from the use, of course, of missiles and also field executions, and the crucial role of the US. Let's just see a clip.
ما في مكان محدد يعني إنه حيكون بخير، يعني كل مكان إحنا بنروح فيه متعرضين فيه للخطر، متعرضين فيه للخوف، متعرضين فيه لضرب المدفعيات، متعرضين فيه للقصف.
102 names we found were killed in one moment, effectively. But there were also allegations that it might have been 200 people who were killed. This is something we've seen multiple times in Gaza because people are trapped under rubble for a really long time.
Air Wars, which monitors civilian harm, has been documenting airstrikes in Gaza. We asked them to examine the December 11th attack.
And what happened in this strike was you had an attack on several different buildings. So when you go through our kind of investigation, you'll see that we split out all of the members of the family by which home they were in order to understand really the scale of devastation.
Do you know how many children were killed in the attack?
So we estimated 50 at least.
And how common was this type of attack that you investigated on December 11th?
I would say this is one of so many.
وامي واخويا واختي ولاد اثنين ماليش غيرهم ولاد اثنين كمان راحوا. انا اولادي ابني وابني ومرتي وبنتي وبنتي هذا طفل لا يبلغ عمره ايام مولود في الحرب.
As I say, really crucial Syrian piece of journalism, and I do recommend everyone watches it. There'll be a link, of course, to click and watch it in the description of this video. I'm really delighted to be joined by Kavitha Chakuru and by Sharif Abdul Kudus, who are two of the brilliant journalists, of course, who made this documentary possible. Hello to you both. How you doing?
Hi.
Good. Thanks for having us.
Firstly, huge congratulations on this crucial piece of work. I think one of the most important pieces of journalism since this all began. So we just thought, actually, what was the purpose for you? Why was it so important to make this particular documentary at this time? I mean, this is now, we're getting on for 9 months of this horror. Who wants to start? Do you want to start with Kavitha? Who, you know, what did you really, the kind of key purpose of doing this right now?
Yeah, I mean, you know, as you mentioned, Al Jazeera has been covering the war extensively, doing crucial work. And for us, you know, within the network, it was important to make sure we were complementing that and not treading the same ground. And so part of that is looking at the US role. And we really wanted to look at that US role and tie it to what's been happening to civilians and to kind of a personal way, their losses. And so we decided to focus on key parts of the war through these families. So we began with a massive airstrike because this bombing campaign, which the US has supported and, you know, the weapons, they provide the weapons to enable it. We started with a massive airstrike from December 11th in North Gaza, in which over 100 people were killed, mostly from the same extended family. And I will say this, one of the reasons we picked that airstrike was because we worked with journalists on the ground. And as we talked to them, they said, hey, did you know that this happened to this family? And we did this airstrike. I mean, this is a huge airstrike, and there wasn't that much reporting on it because by that point, so many journalists were forced out of North Gaza. So there was kind of almost like a core group of journalists left. And so because we were able to work with them, they brought that to our attention, which is what I think all media organizations should be doing, is working with the journalists who know what's happening on the ground. And then kind of moving from there, one of the things that, we noticed as the war was going on, that the US constantly would say in defense of Israel and of their own support of the war was, they're protecting civilians, they're following international law, and in particular, John Kirby pointed to the use of safe zones. And so we focused on an attack on a safe zone in the south, which we've seen those are still continuing to this day, right? And then as we were going through, one of the things we wanted to focus on, because we started really talking about how we were going to do this documentary in December. And then December is when I feel like we really started to see like more and more allegations, because that's when the ground troops were fully in North Gaza. A lot of allegations of field executions, arbitrary executions, white flag killings coming out more and more. And so we wanted to focus on one of those attacks. And as we were going on, as we started working on the attack on Hind Rajab and her family happened, and we kind of realized that we really needed to look at that. And we can talk about it later, but one of the reasons that relates to the US is because of the US constantly deferring to Israel in terms of like an investigation that has clearly not really happened.
I mean, Sharif, on this, for example, when I interviewed the Palestinian-Canadian lawyer, Dana Boutou, she calls this an Israeli-American attack on Gaza, because often the way the US government tries to position itself is almost at arm's length. It kind of presents itself as somehow detached almost in its pronouncements, even as it has provided diplomatic and obviously crucially military support. So just what you think about that in terms of the work you did on this and the way Dana Boutou framed it, for example, and how Palestinians on the ground who you interview and we hear their voices talking about this as an American attack of it.
Well, I think there's no question that the US is deeply complicit in the war on Gaza. This war could not be prosecuted by Israel to this degree without the continued funding and arming and diplomatic support. 70% of Israel's arms come from the United States. And we've seen when the contours of this war were very clear very early on, massive amounts of destruction, massive amounts of killing of civilians, within 2 days, telling 1 million people to evacuate to the south. So clear forcible displacement in numbers larger than the Nakba of 1948. The US continued to supply these weapons. Even the Biden administration was bypassing Congress several times to continue the funding of weapons. And we've seen, despite multiple allegations of war crimes, multiple times that Amnesty International and other groups have proven that US bombs have killed civilians, and there's been no Hamas commanders or any kind of officers in the area where these people were attacked, the US has continued to provide these arms. So it's not only breaking international humanitarian law, it's also breaking domestic US law, which prohibits, for example, providing arms to a country that is preventing humanitarian aid from the US entering a territory, which the Israeli government has done. So I think by all accounts, the US is complicit in this war. It's not just, it's a party to this conflict. And Israel could not continue to prosecute this war without it. And as one of our interviewees says on the program, he says what essentially the US is doing is allowing Israel to continue in this way without having to ask what the cost is. They can just continue dropping as many bombs as they want, and there'll be no accountability for it.
And Kavitha, on this, it's quite interesting. The International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor has issued requests for arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. We're still waiting for those arrest warrants to be accepted. But nonetheless, it's quite striking that the statement made by Karen Carr, the chief prosecutor, made clear that actually that because they don't have access to Gaza, the question of aerial bombardment, there could still be further charges to come relating specifically to that. So what's quite important in this is you detail the clear evidence of how the aerial bombardment itself is in wanton violation of international law. That's really what this, with the experts that you talk to.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key things, and Amnesty has they've done a lot of important investigations specifically on the kind of the question of targeting, right, and indiscriminate bombing. And, it becomes clear, a lot of times I think and I understand it, international lawyers will say, well, without knowing what the Israeli military, what their intended target was, what their intention was, we don't know that it was indiscriminate. At this point, the number of airstrikes we've seen, the number of airstrikes where more than 100 civilians have been killed, I don't know how you can draw any other conclusion than it being clear indiscriminate bombing and a disregard for Palestinian lives.
I mean, on that, for example, Plus 472 magazine in an Israeli-Palestinian publication has looked at the question, for example, of artificial intelligence and lavender and how many civilian targets are acceptable even for what is essentially a low-lying Hamas operative. And we know from previous conflicts that how someone attached to Hamas is defined as extremely expansive in any case. But what this shows is just the level of mass. This is an army which claims to be one of the most sophisticated on earth, hugely sophisticated technology, and yet there are repeated airstrikes in which 50 children, for example, get killed.
Yes, the 972 has reported that, and also a very even scarier part of that algorithm that they use for targeting is called Where's Daddy? And that is, they basically wait until night when the person is going to be home. So they know that they're home. So when they're targeted, they're going to be hit, but that means they're going to be home with their family. And it's called Where's Daddy? So there's very clearly there's no regard for civilian life whatsoever. And we're seeing it manifested in these incredible, horrifying numbers. The number now is close to 40,000. There's untold thousands that are under the rubble and presumed dead. So the number is much higher. And we know from many human rights groups that the forced starvation of people, famine doesn't just go away. Even if we were to allow food in right now, this is going to have long-term effects, and people will die because of this. So I think they've shredded any semblance of regard for international law. The US and Europe are complicit in this shredding of the international order, and as people have said for a long time, the gloves have been off, but now the mask is off.
So, Kavita, with the Israeli army, what they normally say in defense when they're obviously critiqued in any way for the clearly wanton war crimes and crimes against humanity they're committing is, firstly, we telephone in advance civilians to allow advance notice in order for them to flee. And secondly, there are safe zones, which we have allowed or called for the evacuation of civilians to places where they are safe. What does your work say about those Israeli claims, Kavita? I
mean, listen, the idea of a safe zone in Gaza at this point is criminal, I feel like, for them to even continue to suggest that. One of the families our team interviewed is the Al-Gaf family. They are a family from North Gaza. They, on orders from the Israeli military, went to the south. And on December 28th in Khan Yunis, they were living with relatives in a small apartment. That apartment was attacked. It was in a safe zone. Abdullah, his wife was killed. His 2-year-old son, Firas, was killed. His 8-year-old son, Mohammed, was injured. And 25 days later, he died as a result of the fact that there were the strain on hospitals. There was no one there to treat him. There wasn't enough medicine. And they went to the south because they were told it was safe, right? Abdullah, the video of him placing biscuits in his son's shroud went viral. It was when, we saw that video, and I think all of us were just kind of wrecked by it, and we wanted to know more about his story. And that's how we found out that he went there. They went to Khan Yunis because they were told to. They were told it was safe. So civilians are doing what they've been told, trying to find safety, which is a beyond impossible task.
I'm sure what we've constantly heard, I mean, one of those gruesome descriptions or terms we've heard since it began is how an entire family is wiped from the civil registry. So entire extended families, every single member, from grandparents to little kids. I mean, that's not something that normally happens, is it?
No, I mean, this is, so one of the families we profiled, the Selim family, that airstrike on December 11th, where over 100 people, almost all of them extended relatives of their family, are killed. There's other airstrikes on that family in December and leading up into spring, where they lose an astonishing 270 members of their extended family. So this is a pattern. Both the Associated Press documented this, and this actual case and this pattern of wiping out families across generations is a key part of the genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. So yes, entire bloodlines are being wiped out, and families across generations are being wiped out, and it doesn't seem to be stopping in any real way.
Before I ask about the case of Hind Rajab, which is a very important case study, case study I think is rather clinical given the atrocity we're talking about. But before I do, just in terms of the role of Palestinian journalists, this just unprecedented mass slaughter of journalists in such a short period of time, including often, and we spoke about families being wiped out, and that you'll read a journalist killed alongside their family. Just tell Kavitha, just the conditions these journalists are working under and the role they've played in ensuring the world has any understanding of actually really what's been happening in Gaza.
Yeah, so I mean, I can tell you a little bit about some what the journalists who did the filming and reporting in Gaza for us. They, half of the crew, most of the crew actually was in the north. Most of the what we filmed was in the north actually, and which has obviously been the hardest hit when it comes to starvation and famine. And these journalists are going through the same thing. There was a point at one of the journalists said, "Oh, we found a can of beans and we split it between the 10 of us." And so they're going through all of these horrific conditions as they're also reporting on what's happening, documenting what's happening to show the world what's happening. And I really feel like the larger industry has just forgotten them, ignored them, and I kind of wonder if more of the industry, particularly the mainstream industry, Western media centered in the US or even the UK, if they had done a better job from the beginning of the conflict, working with journalists on the ground on a constant basis, if those journalists had been given more support, more attention, if the war would even be at the stage it's at. I feel like that's a fair question to ask. And I feel like it's a gross understatement to say that the larger journalism industry has failed Palestinian journalists, because it is well beyond failure.
I mean, Sharif, just in terms of what does this say about the Western media, where there's, sometimes you hear journalistic solidarity thrown around and you kind of ask who gets that. We've seen, the lions of the world's press pack reporting in the most indescribable kind of apocalyptic conditions, having to juggle surviving in terms of not being bombed, feeding themselves and their family, and reporting on the sorts of horrors which will traumatize people for life. So, I mean, Trav, what does that say about the Western media?
Well, I think it betrays a very heavy bias against Palestinian journalists. When you see a record number, there's a record number of Palestinian journalists who have been killed. The journalists who have not been killed have lost so much. They've lost their families, they've lost their homes, and they're continuing to report. And we've seen that journalists can express open solidarity against unjust practices against journalists. We've seen people openly call for the freeing of Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who's unjustly imprisoned by the Russian government. We do not see anything close to that for Palestinian journalists who are being killed in record numbers. This is shameful, and this is enabling the killing of journalists in Gaza. This is enabling the continuing of this. And the more journalists that are killed, the harder it is to get information out and verify information out of Gaza. So there should be black bans across the newspapers of the world in protest of this killing of journalists, and we're seeing nothing like that.
I mean, Kavitha, in terms of just the way the Western media has framed all of this since the beginning, I mean, the sheer mass slaughter on such a scale, and everything from the bombing to the starvation, deliberate starvation, to, I mean, it's just yesterday, a Palestinian journalist who was pointing out the number of cancer patients and how long they've been without treatment now for 9 months. That's just one serious health condition. People don't even think about this a lot of the time. They don't even think about, just people with untreated medical conditions. I mean, that number could end up being killed more than the people who get bombed. So, I mean, what's that? I mean, just in terms of just what I found just so shocking is there's no subtlety attached. That by the Western media, the way they framed it is very clear that they don't think Palestinian life has anything like the worth of someone who's described as like us, basically. I mean, that's the truth, isn't it? That's the truth of the Western media here.
I mean, without a doubt. There was a comment. There was an interview that Aaron David Miller, a former peace negotiator, gave with the New Yorker a couple of months back, and he said something along the lines of, he kind of like very blatantly said that he admitted, and I don't think he was, it was a shock to him to say it, that Biden clearly does not have the same level of empathy or sympathy for Palestinians that he does Israelis, which is very obvious. I think that extends to the Western media. And I think also we see it reflected in the way, US and UK media cover foreign wars, right? It always feels like an extension of, for US, at least from the US media, it always feels like an extension of US foreign policy as a kind of second layer of not as obvious propaganda, but it's always there to kind of be aligned with the goals and interests of Western foreign policy. And, I wonder a lot about the kind of political press that cover, in DC, who cover the administration, who cover the White House and Congress, and how many of them have ever met someone who was on the other end of a foreign war, right? How many of them have ever spoken to a Palestinian who's lost, dozens of members of their family, right? Or to a Palestinian journalist, right? And I think that all of that kind of lack of interest, that lack of empathy, that is reflected in the way this war has been covered.
And there's been actual studies of this done by places like The Intercept and other outlets that have shown that the language used, for example, the word atrocity or barbaric, how many times it's used in reference to the killing of Israelis on October 7th versus what's happening in Gaza. The use of the passive voice, Gazans are left dead.
Died more than killed. Yeah.
But Israelis are killed. I mean, and then just the rhetorical gymnastics that goes through to avoid saying what's actually happening. I even took a screenshot of a New York Times headline because I couldn't actually believe it. This was the bombing of Jabalia. A massive 2-ton bomb hit Jabalia, and the headline was, "Explosion, Gazans say, was airstrike, leaves many casualties in dense neighborhood." I don't know what that. First of all, it's an assault on the English language.
Yeah.
But this headline is Israel bombs refugee camp. That's what happened. And so there's such a twisting to protect and to sanitize what's happening that directly enables this kind of violence to be able to continue.
Crimes against English language to cover up crimes against people. Yeah. Hind Rajab, I mean, 14,000 children officially have been killed in Gaza, but that's likely to be a drastic underestimate. It doesn't include, for example, many who are believed buried under the rubble and officially classed as missing, for example. And Save the Children yesterday said up to 21,000 children are estimated to be missing for various reasons. That includes people who are probably have been killed in many cases for a long time and not officially registered as such. Hind Rajab was one of them, as were her cousins. For example, the 15-year-old cousin Lion, and she was 5 years old. I don't know. Was she 5 or 6? I know there's been conflicting reports on that. Who wants to just explain what happened there? Because this was a really, I don't know. I mean, it's such a grotesque atrocity on every level. Who wants to just kind of explain this is what happened to Hind Rajab and her family as they sought to flee after an evacuation order by the Israeli army?
Rita, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So Hind, she was 6. Yeah. So our team interviewed her mother, Wissam, in North Gaza. And so in the beginning of the war in October, Wissam and her husband and her 2 children, on orders from the Israeli military, went to the south. They went as far south as Deir Bala. And while they were there, there were already attacks there. And at one point, Wissam's mother, Hind's grandmother, said to her, "Wissam, write your name on your arm. So if you're killed, people know who you are." And that was the moment that she says that she was like, "I'm going to go home. I'm going home then, because if I'm going to be killed, I want to be where people know me. I want to be home." So at this point, she's in a separate car from her husband. And so actually her husband got separated from her and the 2 children. They go back to North Gaza. And at this point, it's just a matter of trying to find safety again, which is impossible. And in January, late on January 28th, at this point, there's heavy bombing in Gaza City. Wissam describes kind of like fire belt bombings that coming into the apartment where they were. So the next morning, she's with her uncle and other relatives, and they decide that they're going to go to a different neighborhood and see if it's safer there. Yeah. Her uncle Bashar, he says, "I'm going to go. It'll be me and my wife with my kids, and I'll take your 2 kids as well, including Hind, and her 4-year-old son Ayad." He jumps out of the car because he doesn't want to be away from his mother. They leave. Almost as soon as they drive away, Wissam describes seeing them come under fire from an Israeli tank. She and the other relatives then are also being attacked, and they are trying to find a way to leave. Eventually, they do. They flee on foot. They keep trying to call the car, and eventually she gets a hold of Leanne. Leanne says, who's 15, she says, "Everyone in the car has been killed except me and Hind. We both were shot and we're bleeding, we're injured." And so the family at this point is just trying to find a way to get someone to save them. And so eventually, after making different calls, the Red Crescent in Ramallah, they call Leanne. They call a few times until she picks up. And at this point, and I think a lot of people, it's in the film, but I think a lot of people would have heard this because the Red Crescent released it pretty quickly on the day it happened on January 29th. It's a short call between Leanne and Omar, who's one of the dispatchers at the Red Crescent. And she's saying, everyone has been killed. There's a tank next to me. They're shooting at me. Then there's a 6-second burst of gunfire and she screams and the line goes dead. So then Omar, after recovering from his own shock of what he heard, calls. I'm sorry. I hope I'm probably telling this too long, but
no, go for it. It's important.
Okay. He calls and eventually Hind picks up, and so he all of a sudden it's this new voice, a younger voice, and she's telling him, everyone is dead. Everyone is dead. He asks, "Where's the girl I talked to?" She says she's dead. He brings in another colleague, Rana, who's also talking to Hind. Again, this audio, the Red Crescent released during the time, and it's in the film, where Hind describes seeing the tank still close, that she's saying it's in front of her. It's very, very close, is what she tells them. And so at this point, the Red Crescent now is trying to find a way to get their ambulance to them. But the thing is that in Gaza, the Red Crescent can't, and the civil defense, they can't send ambulances into certain places without getting clearance and approval from the Israeli military through a branch of Israeli military called Kogat. And so to go through that, the Red Crescent goes through the Palestinian Ministry of Health, which goes to Kogat and says, "We need clearance to get this ambulance to go rescue this little girl who has been shot by by soldiers." As they wait, the team is just trying to keep Hind's hopes up. And their director of mental health comes in at one point to kind of try and do relaxation exercises with her. They're able to patch in her mother at one point, which seemed to help. There's we can't include everything in the film, but there is a part we didn't include, and I wish we could have. And it was the Red Crescent dispatchers at one point talk about how Hind said that she told them both that I don't believe you. I don't believe that you're going to come, because she kept asking, come save me, come get me, and no one was coming. And so eventually the Red Crescent gets approval. They are sent a map of an approved route to go from the hospital to the gas station where the car is, to the coordinates where the car is. And so their ambulance is dispatched. The Red Crescent, as they're recording the call with Hind, they also have a cell phone on speaker where they're talking to the two paramedics, Yusuf and Ahmed. And as we play the audio where you hear them saying, like, are you approaching? And he's saying, I'm approaching. At this point, the sun has gone down, so it's dark. And so they ask if they have their lights and sirens on. And he says, I've got my lights on, not the siren. And then he says, oh, I see it. You can kind of hear him a little bit positive. And then there's a huge noise, this blast, and then they're gone. And so, we know after, it would be 12 days until they could confirm what was clear, which was that the two paramedics had been killed. And that was around 5:40, I want to say. And so the call with Hind continued for about another hour and 20 minutes. And by the end of it, her voice is growing fainter. She throughout the call, she told them that she had been shot 3 times. So it's very clear she's bleeding. The 6-year-old girl is bleeding, and has been bleeding for hours. And at one point, she's not really talking, and they ask her, why aren't you talking, Hind? And she says, my mouth is bleeding. And so they say, why don't you wipe your mouth? And then she says, I don't want to get my sleeve dirty. It'll be work for my mom. And her mom says, don't worry, I'll clean it. And then her voice fades after that. And so, yeah, it would be 12 days until the Israeli military, after the soldiers left that area, that the civil defense were able to go in and retrieve the bodies of the family and the remains, of which there wasn't that much, the remains of the 2 paramedics.
So the analysis found that there were at least 335 bullet holes on the car, that the gunshots could only have been fired realistically by Israeli weapons like the M4, the type of machine gun used on a Merkava tank, which is used, obviously it was a tank. They reported, both Lion and Hind, that they could see a tank. Only the Israeli state obviously has a tank in this context. The analysis found the tank would only have been 1323 meters away. And the conclusion by forensic architecture, who've done this detailed study, at such proximity, it's not plausible that the shooter could not have seen that the car was occupied by civilians, including children. So what we're talking about there is an Israeli tank fired well over 300 bullets at a car that you could see very close to them was full of civilians and children. That's what this is, isn't it? And then an ambulance, which they knew was an ambulance because it's coordinated with them, they then blew up and killed the paramedics. If that happened on the 7th of October, if Hamas militants had done that, these were Israeli kids, on the phone to an Israeli ambulance operator, and then you could hear all of that and what had happened, and you could hear a 15-year-old Israeli girl being shot dead on the call, and then the ambulance was blown up by Hamas militants, that would have been seen as one of the worst atrocities of that day. It would have literally been one of the things that all politicians would speak of, be used to justify the complete destruction of Gaza. It'd be used to say these are the worst atrocities committed since the Nazis. Wouldn't it? That's true, though, isn't it? That's what we're talking about here.
Well, I think also, the level of the amount of evidence we have for what happened on that day is staggering. Israel continues to deny that there was Israeli tanks in the area that day.
Yeah.
There are satellite photos, which we show in the film, of that morning, Israeli tanks in the area. We have the testimony of 2 people, 2 girls, saying they see a tank on a recording. And you hear the tank shooting. We have analysis of the speed of the bullets that match the machine gun that's mounted on a tank. We have the Israeli military. Why would they give an approved route to go to an area where there's no Israeli forces there? So the level of evidence we have, and then just the outright denial versus claims made that are then just swallowed up wholesale. Where at the beginning of this conflict had the 40 beheaded babies story, which came out of President Biden's mouth.
Yeah,
and there's no evidence to it, and it's been proven to be false. So the disparity of what's valued and the claims and the veracity of what people say is so stark. And the State Department was asked specifically about this investigation, about the number of bullet holes in the car. And he continued with his same, well, Israel says that they weren't in the area, they're investigating. Then he said they've asked the UN and the Red Crescent to provide them with information. We hope that information is forthcoming. Just a complete, adopting the Israeli narrative and just allowing for this kind of impunity.
And one thing I just want to add also, just to make sure that analysis, it was done by Forensic Architecture and Earshot, and it's so impressive and crucial. And I bring it up also just to say that the U.S. government, I would assume that they have the same capabilities as Forensic Architecture and Earshot, if not more, as well as a staggering amount of intelligence at their fingertips. So the fact that they're not taking the steps, or at least not publicly taking the steps to do an investigation and find out how, there's evidence of, there were two fragments of 120 millimeter shells found at the scene, one of which was definitively made in the US. Obviously there is the possibility of there were being fighting before or after that attack, but there's a very solid chance that those were used in that attack, right? That's something the US government could find out, and they have been asked about it, and they've just said, we don't know.
Guys, this is such a crucial documentary, and this work is so important given the level of deceit and gaslighting, and that's the modus operandi of the Israeli state in these circumstances, which is to just muddy the waters, deflect, gaslight, lie shamelessly, and then hope people just move on. And then just bracket it as a murky event in the fog of war. Who's to know what really happened? And they've done that all the way through, and they did that before this, obviously. So this is why this journalism is so important, is exposing some of the worst crimes committed in the 21st century, crimes which Western governments, not least the US, are directly involved and complicit in. And it's a testament to the incredible work of Palestinian journalists who risk their lives every single day to bring the truth to the world, so we at least know some of the horrors currently being committed with the aid of the Western governments. Thank you so much. Everyone, do share this video. Make sure the message gets out. Press like, subscribe, leave your comments. Always love to hear your feedback. But to both of you, thank you so much for your brilliant work.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.